The U.S. involvement in the Iraq War was a controversial decision when the U.S. invaded, and it remains controversial more than 10 years after the invasion. This is probably due to the public becoming more aware of the reasons as to why we invaded, which included some reasons that turned out to be untrue, such as the assumption that Iraq and Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and were in alliance with al-Qaeda. As controversial as the invasion of Iraq was, it really did not change U.S. foreign policy that much. The one big thing that changed after the invasion was that the U.S. went into Iraq with the intention of destroying Saddam Hussein's WMDs and ousting him from power, but instead ended up refocusing and prioritizing the rebuilding and stabilizing of Iraq, and would end up focusing more on Afghanistan. Besides these change of plans, much of U.S. foreign policy stayed the same. The Middle East was largely very anti-American because of the U.S.'s alliance with Israel and previous U.S. interventions and involvements in the Middle East, such as the U.S.'s meddling of Iranian politics in the 70s. This anti-American sentiment would remain the same before the invasion and after the invasion. Another thing that would not change after the invasion of Iraq would be the U.S.'s interest in Iraq's oil. The U.S. had been involved in the Middle East previously in the 90s, partially because of Iraq's oil reserves, and the U.S. would continue to be interested in Iraq's oil reserves even after the invasion and the eventual withdrawal of all forces from Iraq. The U.S.'s relationship with Iraq, specifically Saddam Hussein, had been getting worse for a couple of years prior to the invasion. Saddam Hussein ruled as a brutal dictator and was accused multiple times over the years for many human rights violations. But more importantly, the U.S. would go on to accuse Saddam Hussein of manufacturing WMDs and for breaking the rules of the Persian Gulf ceasefire. These WMD accusations would be crucial in the U.S.'s eventual invasion of Iraq in 2003. But another event would prove to be just as important in this decision: the crashing of two hijacked planes into the World Trade Center and another into the Pentagon. This terrorist attack, 9/11, would be claimed by Osama bin Laden of al-Qaeda and would work to encourage the U.S. to take military action. This was clearly stated in President George W. Bush's statement to the nation after 9/11.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices: secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
This speech was intended to reassure the American people that this attack would not go unanswered. Now the Bush administration would start to build a case to take military action against the terror threats in the Middle East and Saddam. The U.S. would eventually go on to invade Iraq under the false pretense that Saddam was in possession of WMDs. But by the end of the war, the focus of U.S. foreign policy would change to focus on the rebuilding and stabilization of Iraq. The Bush administration would first begin building the case for Saddam's possession of WMDs with a speech by Colin Powell to the UN Security Council.
My second purpose today is to provide you with additional information to share with you what the United States knows about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, as well as Iraq's involvement in terrorism.
This was intended to connect Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda together because Saddam had not attacked the U.S. at all, which would give the U.S. no reason to invade him. But if Saddam Hussein were to be connected, then it would give the U.S. a reason to invade and oust him from power and destroy any WMDs that Saddam had. So, going into this war with Iraq, the U.S.'s first priority was to get rid of Saddam Hussein and his WMDs. But this would all change when it was discovered pretty quickly that there were in fact no WMDs in Iraq or held by Saddam. This is clearly stated in the Duffler Report as follows. The Iraq Survey Group, ISG, has uncovered no evidence of Iraq retained Scud variant missiles, and debriefings of Iraqi officials, in addition to some documentation, suggest that Iraq did not retain such missiles after 1991. When it came out that there were no WMDs to be found, U.S. foreign policy had to change and refocus on the other issue of fighting al-Qaeda and terrorism, which was also discovered to be in Afghanistan rather than Iraq, and having connections with Saddam Hussein. This shift in foreign policy would lead to more U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, but due to the failure to find WMDs in the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. did not have much support for this renewed involvement in Afghanistan and was seen by many people as being unnecessary and a guaranteed failure like Iraq. This is illustrated in this political cartoon. This cartoon depicts the U.S. Army charging foolishly from Iraq to Afghanistan into another war. While the U.S. had shifted its focus to Afghanistan, it had also shifted its initial focus in Iraq from seeking out WMDs to rebuilding and stabilizing Iraq, as stated in an address made by President Bush.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country.
This clearly illustrates a major shift in the U.S.'s goals in the invasion of Iraq as more of an occupation and rebuilding of Iraq, which is much different than the initial goals of the U.S. This shift in U.S. foreign policy did not come till a few years after the initial invasion, while some concern regarding Iraq's situation after the fighting was finished was slightly apparent prior to the invasion. An excerpt from the Desert Crossing Seminar After Action Report from 1999 said, "And it struck me then that we had a plan to defeat Saddam's army, but we didn't have a plan to rebuild Iraq. And so I asked the different agencies of government to come together to talk about reconstruction planning for Iraq. This concern voiced as early as 1999 here shows that it was something that the U.S. was always keeping in mind, but their foreign policy still does not truly reflect this until some years after the invasion. The U.S. invasion of Iraq happened because of the initial goals of ousting Saddam, destroying his WMDs, and connecting him with al-Qaeda. But by the time the majority of the fighting was over in Iraq, U.S. foreign policy had shifted to focus more on fighting in Afghanistan and to rebuild Iraq. This shift in foreign policy was also reflected upon during the first presidential debate of 2008, in which Obama said,
"We have to use our military wisely," and we did not use our military wisely in Iraq. We've spent over $600 billion so far, soon to be $1 trillion. We have lost over 4,000 lives. We have seen 30,000 wounded, and most importantly, from a strategic national security perspective, al-Qaeda is resurgent, stronger now than at any time since 2001. We took our eye off the ball, and not to mention that we are still spending $10 billion a month when they have a $79 billion surplus at a time when we are in great distress here at home, and we just talked about the fact that our budget is way overstretched.
This passage conveys how the U.S. had to justify their presence in Iraq after their initial goal failed due to it being incorrect, and how this change in foreign policy would lead to a prolonged stay in Iraq, and how a lot of money had to be spent on it because of that. While there are some changes to U.S. foreign policy after the invasion, many things still remain the same. One of those being the U.S.'s interest in Iraq's oil. Oil has been one of the main reasons for U.S. involvement in the Middle East for a long time, and it was a big reason why we were involved in Iraq to begin with. Iraq had and still has very large oil reserves that the U.S. is dependent on, and that the U.S. spent a lot of money on, as well as making a lot of money on. The U.S. had been interested in the oil in Iraq for a while before the invasion. It was just in the early 90s that the U.S. first fought Iraq in the Persian Gulf War after Saddam invaded Kuwait. In an excerpt from a 2001 report on energy security commissioned by Dick Cheney, the U.S.'s interest in Iraqi oil is shown. Iraq remains a destabilizing influence to the flow of oil to international markets from the Middle East. Saddam Hussein has also demonstrated a willingness to threaten to use the oil weapon and to use his own export program to manipulate oil markets. This would display his personal power, enhance his image as a pan-Arab leader, and pressure others for a lifting of economic sanctions against his regime. The United States should conduct an immediate policy review toward Iraq, including military, energy, economic, and political/diplomatic assessments. This passage clearly works to convey the interest and worry of the U.S. regarding oil in Iraq before the invasion. This interest in oil would continue throughout the war and is still seen today. In an excerpt from a hearing regarding the U.S.'s current relations with Iraq in 2013, oil is important yet again. The United States does not take sides in the international disputes regarding the distribution of revenues and management of oil resources. Thus, we are focused on increasing oil production and exports, overcoming the hurdles companies face when operating in Iraq, reducing bottlenecks, and lending technical expertise as appropriate under our Strategic Framework Agreement. These efforts will accelerate over the coming months, including with a Joint Coordination Committee on Energy Cooperation early next year. This shows how the U.S. is still very much interested in Iraq's oil and in making it easier for American companies to operate there. Even 10 years after the initial invasion, U.S. foreign policy continues to be interested and involved in Iraq's oil. For most of recent history, the U.S. has not been very well liked in the Middle East for reasons ranging from its alliance with Israel to its involvement in other Middle Eastern affairs. And this was the case prior to the Iraq invasion, and it remained that way after the U.S. withdrawal. This anti-American sentiment has affected U.S. foreign policy, and that has led to the U.S. trying to recreate its image in the Middle East to improve the perception of the U.S. by the Middle East. These feelings toward America were seen in Iran by these comments made by the current supreme leader of Iran in 1997. The American regime and the international Zionist network, having been frustrated by the failure of their economic and military confrontation with the Islamic Republic, have now intensified their publicity campaigns to influence the soul and minds of world Muslims who are sympathetic to Iran, and particularly to frustrate the faithful Iranian people. The American government speaks of human rights, while they themselves, when dealing with weaker nations, have the most contemptible records of violation of human rights. This obvious disdain shown here toward the U.S. shows how the U.S. was not well liked at all prior to the invasion of Iraq. The U.S. invasion and involvement in Iraq did nothing to stop this attitude from spreading, and this can be seen in a translated excerpt from a modern ISIS propaganda video. America, you claim to have the greatest army history has known. You may have the numbers and weapons, but your soldiers lack the will and resolve, still scarred from their defeats in Afghanistan and Iraq. They return dead or suicidal, with over 6,500 of them killing themselves each year. So while you go around cooking facts on the results of your military airstrikes, we continue to haunt the minds of your soldiers and sow fear into their hearts, with 18 of your soldiers committing suicide each day before you've even advanced. This proud anti-American propaganda is very similar to that of the supreme leader from Iran in 1997, which shows that the sentiment in the Middle East toward the U.S. has stayed the same from the prior to the war to after the war. Not only did this anti-American sentiment negatively affect U.S. foreign policy, but some say that it even strengthened jihad against the U.S. In a symposium on Iraq's future impact on U.S. foreign and defense policy, the Iraq War strengthens jihad against the United States. Movements like the jihad thrive on powerful imagery of Muslims as victims and winners, Simon said. Iraq has provided a plethora of these images, he said. Steele explained the Iraq War has highlighted how U.S. policies can incite terrorism and predicted increasing calls for the U.S. to avoid entanglement in places where terrorist activities are provoked. This excerpt illustrates how the invasion of Iraq did not help these anti-American feelings, which can and have led to terrorist attacks. In fact, this document shows how the Iraq War actually made the American image in the Middle East worse than before, due to the dishonesty of U.S.'s initial intentions in invading Iraq and the large amount of civilian casualties, which affects U.S. foreign policy greatly. The Iraq War conflict is very similar to the Vietnam War, in that the invasion of Iraq was supposed to be a quick mission of simply overthrowing Saddam and destroying his WMDs, but when this turned out to not be the case, the U.S. was then stuck in Iraq with the extremely difficult task of rebuilding and stabilizing it. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam was similar and that the invasion of Vietnam was also supposed to be a quick conflict with the sole purpose of stopping the spread of communism, but it also would turn into an expensive, prolonged conflict that was not held high in public opinion, much like the Iraq War. Overall, the Iraq War led to some changes in U.S. foreign policy, but much of foreign policy would continue to stay as it was before the invasion.